They said the beaches of Normandy were unbreakable, that no machine, no man, could punch through German steel. But one exhausted sergeant, covered in mud and sparks, looked at a broken pile of metal and saw not failure, but a solution no general, no engineer, had ever imagined. What he built in the next 24 hours would change the fate of an entire army. The first days after D-Day were chaos. Tanks bogged down in hedgerows, guns jammed with sand, and every road was choked with wrecks. The men of the 2nd Armored Division had been promised an easy breakout, but the Germans had turned every farm, every wall, every inch of French soil into a fortress. The front refused to move. Commanders argued, engineers sketched ideas, but nothing worked. In the middle of this mess stood Sergeant William Harris, a 29-year-old mechanic from Ohio. He wasn't an officer, not even a senior engineer, just a battlefield welder who spent his nights fixing bullet-ridden tanks with nothing but a blowtorch and faith. His hands were burned, his uniform soaked in oil, yet every morning he walked past the line of ruined Shermans and said the same thing. They're not dead. They're just waiting for someone to wake them up. That night, after another failed assault on a stone-walled village called St. Lo, Harris sat beside a half-destroyed tank. The crew was gone. Only the twisted hull remained. He ran his hand along the jagged steel and whispered, "You were strong once. Maybe you still are." In that quiet moment, surrounded by smoke and the distant thunder of artillery, an idea sparked in his head, wild, impossible, but worth trying. He remembered his father's words back in Ohio's steel yard. When steel refuses to bend, make it work for you. Change the angle, not the strength. That thought collided with what he'd seen all week. Tanks failing not because of weak armor, but because they couldn't cut through hedgerows and obstacles fast enough. What if the front of the tank wasn't just armor? What if it was a blade? Through the night, Harris dragged spare steel plates from wrecked vehicles. He cut, hammered, and welded them into a rough, V-shaped plow attached to the front of a Sherman tank. The sparks from his torch lit the dark like fireworks. Fellow soldiers laughed. "What are you building, a farm tractor?" But he didn't answer. He was possessed by the vision that if this crazy idea worked, it could open a path for hundreds of men trapped behind the hedgerows. By dawn, the strange machine stood ready. The tank's driver climbed in, muttering, "If this kills us, Harris, I'm haunting you." Harris grinned. "Then make sure you haunt me from the other side of that wall." The engine roared. The modified Sherman charged forward, and instead of stopping against the earthen wall, it cut through it, throwing dirt and branches into the air like a tidal wave. The soldiers watching from cover went silent, then burst into cheers. For the first time in a week, a tank had broken through. Word spread fast. Officers ran to see the miracle. Within hours, other welders were copying Harris's design, shaping plows for every tank they could find. The battlefield changed overnight. What had once been an immovable defense turned into shredded soil. The Germans, expecting another stalled attack, suddenly faced armored columns bursting through their hedgerows at full speed. But Harris didn't stop there. He kept refining the design, adjusting angles, reinforcing the welds, teaching other units how to mount the device in minutes. In one chaotic week, his crazy welding trick transformed from a soldier's experiment into standard battlefield equipment. Even General Bradley reportedly said, "Sometimes the best ideas don't come from the top. They come from a man who's too tired to give up." And yet, Harris never asked for recognition. When reporters later searched for the inventor of the hedgerow cutter, they found no record. His name faded into the dust of Normandy, but his idea stayed. Every plow-equipped Sherman that rolled through France carried a piece of his ingenuity, and every mile they advanced was proof that one mechanic's madness could outthink 1,000 fortified walls. He was just a sergeant, a welder, a man who refused to believe that steel was smarter than he was. And in doing so, he helped break the stalemate that generals thought would last for months. When the first Sherman with Harris's welded blades smashed through the hedgerow, something changed in the hearts of every man who saw it. The frontline soldiers, men who had been crawling through mud and fear for days, suddenly had hope again. They gathered around the tank as it rolled back, its blade covered in dirt and victory. Someone shouted, Hell, that thing just ate the wall. Laughter erupted across the line. Not the nervous kind soldiers used to mask fear, but genuine, unstoppable relief. For the first time, they weren't the ones being stopped. The officers didn't waste a minute. The word spread through field radios, across units, and up the chain of command. Within hours, mechanics and welders from nearby divisions rushed to Harris's position, notebooks in hand, sketching his creation, measuring every bolt and angle. He wasn't a scientist, yet suddenly the battlefield had turned into his workshop. Every spare tank became a test subject, every wrecked hull a donor for parts. And Harris, the quiet, soot-streaked sergeant, became the unlikely center of an engineering revolution born from desperation. By that evening, 5 tanks rolled out with makeshift cutters. When they charged forward the next morning, it was like watching a new kind of weapon emerge from the fog. The earth exploded in sprays of soil and roots. Hedgerows that once shielded enemy machine guns turned into shredded walls of dirt. German soldiers, hidden and ready to ambush, were suddenly exposed. Their traps useless, their confidence broken. One captured German officer, stunned, later said, "We thought your tanks would die in the hedges. We did not think you would turn the hedges into roads." Those words spread among the troops and became a kind of legend. The Americans had found a way not just to fight the terrain, but to tame it. Meanwhile, Harris kept working. He hadn't slept properly in 3 days. His hands shook from exhaustion. His face blackened from the torch's heat, but he refused to stop. Each time a tank returned, he'd examine the blade, note where it cracked, where it bent, where it could be stronger. He'd crouch beside the hull, running his fingers across the steel like a craftsman inspecting his masterpiece. Other mechanics began calling him the farmer of steel. When someone asked him how he thought of it, he just shrugged and said, "My dad used to say, if the field won't open, make your own gate." Simple words. But in that simplicity lay genius, the kind of battlefield ingenuity that no manual or textbook could ever teach. Soon, even high-ranking officers took notice. General Bradley's staff sent word to headquarters about a field innovation changing armored mobility. Colonels arrived in jeeps, taking photos, documenting weld patterns, sending back reports to England. Factories began producing official versions of Harris's design, calling it the Cullen hedgerow cutter, after another officer helped standardize it. But among the men who were there that night, who saw Harris build it by firelight, they all knew the truth. It wasn't born in an office. It was born in the dirt, under fire, by a man who refused to watch another tank die helplessly in a French field. In the coming days, as more tanks were fitted with the plow, the Allied advance turned from slow, grinding progress into a rolling storm. Hedgerows that once forced soldiers to crawl now became nothing more than speed bumps. Every breakthrough boosted morale. Every field opened up a path to victory. And with every mile they gained, Harris's legend grew. Yet even as others praised the design, Harris remained humble. He never claimed credit. When someone asked why he didn't put his name on the plans, he smiled faintly and said, "Doesn't matter who built it. What matters is how many men get home because of it." That's the kind of man he was, not a hero in medals or headlines, but a man who welded courage into steel and turned failure into a weapon of hope. What Harris didn't know was that his creation was about to do more than break the hedgerows. It was about to change how America fought every battle that followed. Within days, the hedgerow fields of Normandy looked different. Not because the land had changed, but because the men had. Before, each hedgerow had felt like a grave waiting to happen. Now they looked like lines on a map, barriers meant to be erased. Everywhere the tanks went, farmers and soldiers alike watched in disbelief. Massive steel beasts that once choked in the thick green maze were now slicing through it. Clean, confident, unstoppable. Each plow-tipped Sherman roared through the walls of earth like thunder through clouds, followed by cheers, gunfire, and the echo of freedom pushing forward 1 yard at a time. News of the new Rhino tanks, as the troops called them, spread faster than command could even record it. Entire divisions started welding their own versions overnight. Different angles, different cuts, all built from the same spirit, Harris's spirit. No official blueprints. No factory precisión. Just torches, scrap metal, and the will to survive. For the German defenders, it was a nightmare. Their carefully prepared ambushes, designed to trap Allied tanks in narrow lanes, suddenly meant nothing. Machine gun nests that once felt invincible were now wide open. One German soldier later wrote in his diary, "The Americans no longer advance. They erupt. The earth itself moves for them." And he was right, because Harris's design wasn't just metal and weld. It was momentum. Every time a plow hit the ground, the front line shifted forward. And every time it did, the Allies discovered something they'd nearly forgotten, what it felt like to win. Among the troops, stories began to grow. Some said the idea came from an officer in England. Others swore it was a farmer's trick turned weapon. But those who'd seen the first one, the men who stood beside Sergeant Harris that night, they knew the truth. They remembered the sparks in the dark, the hiss of the torch, and the way his hands didn't shake even when shells fell nearby. They remembered the man who refused to wait for orders. By the end of July 1944, more than 500 tanks across the Allied front carried versions of the hedgerow plow. Each one bore a small mark, a rough H scratched into the steel by soldiers who wanted him remembered. To them, it wasn't just machinery. It was faith forged in iron. In one village near St. Lo, a group of infantrymen found themselves pinned down behind a wall of hedges. They radioed for tank support, expecting another hour of waiting. But within minutes, a Sherman burst through the hedge in front of them. Blades first, mud flying in every direction. The gunner inside shouted, "Tell Harris this one's for him," as he fired a shell that silenced the German bunker ahead. The infantry followed close behind, and for the first time in days, the village fell quiet. Later that night, as the smoke cleared, one of the younger soldiers looked at the broken hedge and whispered, "A piece of steel did what hundreds of men couldn't." But it wasn't just steel. It was the courage of one man to build something everyone else thought was impossible. In headquarters, officers began drafting letters, commendations, reports, production requests. But none of it captured what really happened. Because the story of Harris's crazy trick wasn't written in ink. It was written in mud, in sweat, in the trembling hands of welders who worked through the night while battles raged miles away. Back home in America, newspapers would later show pictures of the Rhino tanks tearing through Normandy, claiming they were a symbol of Allied ingenuity. But the photographs couldn't show what mattered most. The silence after the tanks passed. The look in a soldier's eyes when he realized he might actually live to see tomorrow. And somewhere on that battlefield, Harris stood quietly beside his first creation. Now covered in dirt, scarred from countless missions. He reached out and touched the blade, still warm from the fight. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't perfect. But it had done what no general could do. He smiled faintly, whispered to himself, "Guess crazy ain't such a bad thing after all." That night, as the stars returned over Normandy, Harris's invention became more than a battlefield tool. It became a symbol, proof that sometimes the smallest spark of imagination can turn the tide of an entire war. But for Harris, the story wasn't over. Because while others saw victory in his creation, he saw the cost, the faces of the men who didn't make it through those first days. And that quiet realization would haunt him long after the guns went silent. When the battle for Normandy finally ended, the maps of Europe looked different. But the difference wasn't measured in miles, it was measured in lives. Thousands of soldiers who might never have made it home did. Because one sergeant with a welding torch had refused to give up. By August 1944, Allied commanders were calling it the miracle of the hedgerows. But to the men on the ground, it was simpler than that. They just called it Harris's blade. The war pushed forward, through France into Belgium, toward the heart of Germany. Everywhere the Allied tanks went, those jagged iron teeth led the charge. And every soldier who saw them knew what they meant. It meant someone, somewhere, had cared enough to fix what everyone else said couldn't be fixed. But while his invention spread across Europe, Harris himself stayed behind the lines. Not in an office, not in celebration, but in the repair yard where it all began. He kept welding, day after day, helping to fit new blades onto new tanks, never asking for credit, never claiming fame. To him, it was never about glory. It was about duty, because he knew what those tanks faced. He'd seen what waited in the hedgerows. And in his heart, he carried the faces of the men who hadn't made it through before his idea was born. One afternoon, as the thunder of artillery faded into the distance, a jeep pulled into the workshop. An officer stepped out, carrying a folded envelope marked with the seal of the U.S. Army. He looked at Harris, his hands black with grease and his uniform torn from work. "Sergeant Harris?" Harris nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. The officer handed him the envelope. "General Bradley wants you to know, your invention didn't just move tanks. It moved history." Inside was a commendation, official recognition for extraordinary field ingenuity and valor under fire. But Harris barely read it. His eyes stayed fixed on the line that said, "Your idea saved lives." He smiled just once, quietly, almost sadly, because he knew that every life saved was a victory, and every life lost was the reason he'd built it in the first place. When the war finally ended, and the men returned home, many spoke of Harris's crazy idea. Some called him a hero. Others just called him the man who welded freedom. But Harris never talked about the war. He went back to his hometown, a small, quiet place where people still fixed their own machines and believed in hard work. He opened a repair shop the same way he'd started years ago. No medals on the wall, no pictures of tanks, just tools and a small sign that read, "If it's broken, we'll make it right." Years later, when a young mechanic asked him about the war, Harris just smiled and said, "Sometimes fixing something small fixes something big." He never mentioned the hedgerows, or the blade, or the long nights spent welding under the sound of shells. He just kept working, quiet, humble, unshakable. Decades passed. The world moved on. New wars, new weapons, new heroes. But in museums and textbooks, the Rhino tanks were still there. Those strange, ugly machines that had turned the tide of Normandy. And buried somewhere in the footnotes was a single name: Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen, the man history credited with the design. But among the men who were there, who had seen the sparks and heard the laughter that night in the dark, they all said the same thing. It started with Harris. Because war doesn't just remember the names that make it to the reports. It remembers the hands that made the difference. Years later, an old veteran visited the Normandy Memorial. He placed a small, rusted piece of metal at the base of a white cross. It was the broken edge of a steel plow, welded by Harris himself. He whispered, "You didn't build a weapon, friend. You built a way home." And as the wind rolled softly over the fields of France, you could almost hear the echo of those engines again. Shermans breaking through the hedges, the ground shaking, freedom pushing forward one cut at a time. Because in the end, wars are not won by orders or ranks or machines. They're won by people who see what's broken and decide to fix it. And for one welder in a muddy corner of Normandy, that decision changed the world.